deductive ability and your ability to function in the world across time. You have your own nature, and it's best to work with it rather than against it. You don't want to just win, you want to get better while you play, right? So you want to find a partner who's as good as you, or maybe even slightly better. And then that puts you on the edge, right? Edge of what? Edge of the development of your perceptions, your attention, and your action. So you become a more skilled player. If you're disagreeable and self-centered, you can learn to do well for others by practice. If you're too agreeable and you sacrifice to others, you can dispense with your resentment and learn to stand up for yourself. These are things that everybody needs to know, and they're not only of abstract intellectual interest, they're extraordinarily practical. You need to know about personality to hire people properly and to place them and to promote them, and to do the same with yourself. It helps you understand your children better, it helps you understand your wife better. We deal with personalities all the time. We are personalities. You'll walk through dream analysis with Freud and analysis of religious mythology with Carl Jung and analysis of the dark tetrad personality types. You'll learn about communicating with others, negotiating with others, and developing your own personality, for better or for worse. So, why personality and its transformations? Well, because people are something, and they're also becoming something. And so if you want to understand personality, you have to understand it as a state and as a transformative process. And of those two, probably the transformative process is most relevant, because the transformative process is essentially equivalent to consciousness. And there's nothing that's more emblematic of what a human being is than the process of consciousness. So personality and its transformations, state and process. Why a clinical introduction? Well, some people who teach personality are also social psychologists, and a smaller minority are clinical psychologists, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and so I got interested in personality through clinical psychology rather than the reverse. So I'm interested in understanding personality as it pertains to mental health, or even flourishing, you might say, as opposed to psychopathology and the hell that accompanies mental illness. And so that's the rationale for the clinical approach. So, and that means that what we'll cover in some ways is more theoretical than might be the case for people who are trained more purely empirically or from the social perspective. I'm very interested in the philosophical approaches to religious and philosophical approaches to personality, as well as the
What
scientific
a fucking
approaches, and I think
fail.
they're reconcilable.
He was buying everything.
So one of the
Fuck me.
experiences you might have if you train as a clinical psychologist is going to be depending on the school that you attend, is that the psychoanalytic types, who are increasingly rare, are set against the behaviorist and more physiological types, or vice versa. The behaviorists are set against the psychoanalysts, but from my perspective, they're just viewing the same set of phenomena from different perspectives. And one of the things that I'm going to help you appreciate is the hierarchical nature of personality, the fact that it can be analyzed at multiple levels, that there's some apparent internal contradiction depending on where you start, depending at what level at which you approach the problem, but that those contradictions are more apparent than real. So I'll endeavor to provide you with something approximating a coherent and complete description of personality, lacking in detail as all forms of knowledge are, but one that will allow you to reconcile the findings of the more empirical biologists, let's say, and behaviorists, more abstract psychoanalytic thinkers and phenomenologists. I believe that all those levels of analysis have their utility. To the degree that they're correct, they're not going to be fundamentally disunited, assuming that there's something coherent about both personality and there is something that will be a long time thinking to start to understand not only how the theories differ, of conception and process over that entire period of time. And that's also something extremely interesting to know, as setting yourself in a historical context that's that archaic gives you a much more fundamental sense of who you are and where you came from. And it's also the case that understanding those extremely archaic ideas, which also tend to be very fundamental and unchanging, sheds substantive light on many of the things that you'll experience in the modern world, most particularly the meaning of the narratives, the fictional representations, the movies and dramas that grip your imagination and entertain you. There's a reason that a fictional representation is entertaining when it's of high quality. And the reason is that it echoes in your soul, so to speak, at a very, very deep level. And one of the things that you'll come to understand more deeply, I hope, in consequence of this course, is why that echoing occurs. Then we'll talk about the psychoanalytic tradition. Now, the more strictly scientific types tend to be skeptical of the analytic tradition. And that's a big mistake. It's partly because the scientific enterprise actually has a number of stages, let's say. And one stage is scientific hypothesis testing and data analysis, careful experimental analysis. The behaviorist types, who are pretty physically grounded, were very good at that end of the scientific enterprise, as were the psychometricians, who concentrated on the measurement of personality. But the psychoanalysts were exceptionally good at generating hypotheses, and that's a more unexamined part of the scientific tradition. Where do ideas come from? How do you generate an idea that's innovative and interesting? And the Freud and Jung, let's say, and their associates and followers were unbelievably innovative in their approach to conceptualizations of the human mind. And I would also say that recent developments, especially with regards to large language models and artificial intelligence, have demonstrated, I believe, conclusively, that the psychoanalysts were exactly on the right track in relationship to the structure of the human unconscious. And we'll go into that in some detail. And that's something very new. I've only been able to understand that relationship in the last 2 years, let's say, because the large language models have really only been on the scene for that length of time. So I think large language model cognition can help us understand what the psychoanalysts technically meant by symbol. You know, one of the reasons the behaviorists, who are more down to earth, let's say, have criticized the psychoanalysts, literary critics for that matter, is their claim that the interpretations laid out by people like Freud and Jung were nothing but projections of the imagination. They bore no relationship to reality, no demonstrable relationship to reality. But the large language model calculations are predicated on the idea in a way that every word or every idea is surrounded by a cloud of ideas that are highly likely to co-occur together statistically, right? So you could imagine that the word witch, for example, is quite likely to be accompanied by words like cauldron or coven, and very unlikely to be surrounded by words like skyscraper or stainless steel. And so that a given concept exists within a cloud of associated conceptions, and the elaboration of that cloud of associated conceptualizations is something like the symbolic analysis, the free association symbolic analysis of the psychoanalysts, and also of the symbolic investigation of the literary critics. I suspect we're on the cusp, in the realm of artificial intelligence, of mathematically systematizing our assessment of symbolic representations. I already have a large language model built that's predicated on my work that's very good at dream analysis. And so that means to me, and I think this will happen, that the analysis of dream images will become something that can be purely scientific and mathematically encapsulated. So, and I really believe the psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, were on the right track conceptually and practically with regards to the investigation of the symbolic meaning of dreams. and literature for that matter, drama. So that's extremely exciting. The idea that we can make not only a science, but even a mathematical model of the symbolic landscape that we inhabit. So we'll delve into that in some detail. Carl Rogers and the humanists. The humanist tradition is, I think it's a secularization of Christianity, essentially. Carl Rogers himself was a missionary before he lost his religious faith, and his representation of human personality in psychotherapy, because Rogers was very involved in the psychotherapeutic tradition, is a recasting of the Christian idea of redemption into the realm of secular mental health and psychopathology. Rogers believed that truth-seeking in the psychotherapeutic process was intrinsically redemptive, which is a restatement, you might say, of the gospel notion that the truth will set you free. We'll delve into Rogers, analyzing in particular his conception of dialogue as transformative, and do our best to understand what that means practically, let's say, with regard to your relationship with yourself, but also to other people, and also what it means in relationship to the genesis of psychopathology and its cure. Existentialism and phenomenology. The existentialists, the Freudians, let's say, the Freudians made the essential presumption that the trauma was the cause of much psychopathology, that the default human personality was healthy, but when it suffered damage, especially early in life, the healthy developmental path was circumvented and various forms of pathology emerged. The existentialists questioned that particular Freudian presumption, making the case instead, which is also a case grounded in deep religious tradition, that the vagaries of human existence are such that suffering capable of generating psychopathology is not necessarily a consequence of trauma, but built into the structure of human existence itself, not least because we're self-conscious, say, and aware of our own mortality, which is a existential problem of sufficient magnitude to give us all grounds for a certain degree of mental illness and perhaps even malevolence in the absence of any particular marked trauma, which is not to say that some people don't have it worse than others, or that you won't have it worse at some times in your life than others, and you will. It's not to say as well that the consequences of having it worse might not have some additional influence, let's say, on the course of the development of your personality. I really like the existentialist approach because I think that the notion that what would you say, mental health problem, so to speak, the problem of psychopathology is not a consequence of the deviation of the normative or ideal human pathway, but something that's baked into the structure of human existence itself, that we all have to grapple with the finitude of our existence, let's say, and our subjugation to suffering, and that understanding that, how that warps and dements us, and also how that might be dealt with in a forthright manner, is of great utility. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's not precisely a personality theorist in the classical sense, although is definitely an existentialist, made the case that the lies attendant on the human proclivity to deny the existential reality of our own experience not only warped our souls in the most profound of ways, but also laid the groundwork for the development of the terrible atrocity-seeking totalitarian states that most particularly characterized the 20th century. And so the other great contribution of the existential theorists, as far as I'm concerned, is their ability to link the inadequacy of any given individual's approach to the existential problems of their own life with the emergence of something like state-sponsored hell on earth. And I think that's something of absolutely crucial significance to understand. There's probably, one of the cliches that emerged in the aftermath of the Holocaust in World War II or prior to World War II, prior to and during World War II, was the notion that we should never forget what happened. But you can't remember something you don't understand, and it's not particularly easy to derive the lesson from Auschwitz. Now, the existentialists, and again, I would say particularly Solzhenitsyn, went further, and Viktor Frankl went further along that path than anyone else, trying to draw a relationship between your individual moral obligations, your failure to live up to them, and the genesis of the authoritarian catastrophes that characterized the secular 20th century. The phenomenologists I find particularly interesting because they, following Heidegger, approach the problem of what constitutes reality in a very unique manner. The more scientifically oriented Enlightenment behaviorist types and the psychometricians make the assumption that the most appropriate way to conceptualize reality, the truest way of conceptualizing reality, is in relationship to its objective truth. Now, there's some problems with that presumption in that our experience of reality, which in some complex way is indistinguishable from reality itself, has an irreducibly subjective element, which the objective tradition has a very difficult time dealing with. The phenomenologists attempted to circumvent that subjective-objective dichotomy by describing reality itself as that which is experienced. And adopting that approach, well, first of all, profoundly transforms the manner in which you think about what constitutes the real if you assume consciously or implicitly that only the objective is real. You cast your own emotions, motivational states, and dreams, fantasies, visions of the future, even the meaning of your life, into something that constitutes some second-order reality or even a non-reality, and that has potentially devastating, that contributes in a potentially devastating way to the development of a kind of life-devouring nihilism. If you're nothing but a brief flicker of flame, composed of dust on a third-rate planet at the edge of a minor galaxy, it's very easy to become cynical and dismissive about the fact of existence itself and your own life, and reconstituting your idea of what constitutes reality on the assumption that what you experience is the most foundational, is the fundament and the foundation, transfigures the manner in which you might conceptualize the dignity and significance of your own existence. And that's crucial existentially, because if you have contempt for yourself, as a second-order reality, let's say, it's very easy for that to become contempt for other people and even contempt for existence itself. And that's a very dangerous road to walk down, and one whose nature has been laid out quite comprehensively in the religious and mythological representations of man and woman that we already discussed, and in the psychoanalytic and existential traditions. So the analysis of the phenomenological approach, which puts human experience at the center of things, or maybe even experience itself, or maybe even conscious experience itself, is a powerful antidote to that dehumanizing objectivism, let's say. And Heidegger himself formulated his philosophy upon which the phenomenological approach was predicated in order to combat that dehumanization, and then paradoxically fell prey to the Nazi ideology and so degenerated into a supporter of precisely the kind of psychopathological approach that he, in principle, was attempting to fight. So, ironic twist in 20th century history. The Piagetian tradition. Jean Piaget, developmental psychologist, not often regarded as a personality theorist, but that's generally because personality theorists don't know how to integrate his thinking into the personality tradition. And I think I know how to do that, and so that's not a problem. I like Piagetian thought a lot, not least because it points, and he knew this, to something approximating an emergent morality that has a certain grounding in the objective. So Piaget noted, and we'll delve into this in some detail, that the games that children spontaneously play have a particular pattern. So part of that pattern would be, if I force you to play, that's not a game, and I'm not going to be a popular child, and you're going to be a bitter and resentful kid in consequence of the force and compulsion that's being applied to you. A game, a true game, has to be voluntary, has to have rules that both parties accept and are willing to abide by. There's only there's a pattern, you might say, to games that have that quality and that can be played sustainably, or that can be played in an improving manner. And you might say the essence of the set of all playable games that can be played in an improvable manner is the foundation of morality. Is a very important thing to understand. You see that importance of that make itself manifest in the stages of childhood where children start to become truly social, which starts to emerge around the age of 3, when they can begin to take the perspective of someone else, when they begin to have true friends, when they can engage in reciprocally altruistic behavior, when they can take turns and share, right, which is to begin to learn how to treat another person as if they had the same status and importance as themselves or their own desires. That capability, well developed, makes them highly socialized, popular and happy children, and also turns them into the kinds of adults who can engage in sustainable and improving patterns of cooperative and competitive behavior with other people, which is a good way, for example, of conceptualizing a friendship or a marriage. It's a game that can iterate, repeat, it has a certain pattern, and the iteration produces improvement as it progresses. Now, you can imagine that there's many ways of interacting with people that do not have that property. And a small subset, a straight and narrow path, you might say, that characterizes the set of interactions that do have that property. And if the goal is voluntarily sustained improvement of function, socially distributed, that's not much difference than the establishment of a transcendent ethic, the transcendent ethic upon which morality itself might be predicated. And so that's a very useful and interesting thing to understand. You know, it's a great antidote to the idiot moral relativism that proclaims that all approaches to social interaction are diverse first in their essence, and also of equivalent value, because there's no transcendent ethic, no possibility of a transcendent ethic. I think that's mostly just an escape from fundamental responsibility rather than an intelligent approach. But I also think that the Piagetian analysis of the emergence of games in children, which you could dismiss if you were casual in your thinking as something relatively trivial. Why be interested in the games that children play before they're mature? His analysis of what children are doing is so profound that it points the way to the reconciliation between the religious viewpoint and the scientific viewpoint, which was actually what Piaget was trying to do. That was his motivation. And so that's really something to understand as well. I also like the Piagetian tradition because it builds it allows for the comprehension of personality from the bottom up, so to speak. Piaget was interested, for example, in what he called the basic reflexes that children bring into that infants bring into the world when they're born.
Radiš.
Micro movements and
Jesi nabavio tastaturu?
capable of manifesting
Kakva je
upon which the
tastatura?
entire superstructure of socialized personality is erected.
Kaj je ošao u gamersku show, neko druže. Što je fetinija? Ako pukne,
Koliko je
daleko
gamerska?
Jo, ba nemam pojma 2 struje, brate.
Ujebo, te sunc. Pa ja dobro, to jeste standardna neka cijena najjeftinije.
Rekao, da pošle ti ona dole u čošku, kaj 16, odlično je rekao.
Da, najbolja.
Uzeo sam mišnjaka, ali ono je dobar, a mišlj je dobar, njega sam platio malo više.
Koliko malo više?
Oko putovanke, 50 minuta.
Dobro je.
Tamo da mi je radio i ali tu ima 5 tipki, ali tako, nije više, 2, 4, 6, 8 tipki. Ne znam što će mi toliko tipki, ali to ne. Evo ga, kamiončić čopir lagano, ček dok se vrti na glavi odmah.
Ne, slušaj, nemoj desni taster ti pritiskati kad ulaziš u igru. Desni taster ti je napravljen znači da vrati se nazad, return, cancel, sve. Znači, pricneš lijevi, ništa više. Čekaš kamiončić dok odradi svoje i boli te briga. Ako klikneš desni, vraća ga na početnu sliku. Znači, to je neki debilizam koji su Nije to logično, to je debilizam. To je debilizam, znači, kod njih. To je neki debilizam, znači, kvalitetan debilizam. Znači, to je bez veze tako napravljeno, ali šta ćeš, tako je napravljeno.
I večeras majko 27 na noć. A ovo ja bi trebao 100%. Jel' tako?
Da? Pa meni pričaš ili nekom drugom?
Ne, ovam.
Aha.
Ha?
It's a brutal, bloody business. One of the things you learn as a clinician, especially if you do IQ testing, is the absolute scope of the intellectual differences between people. They're stunning, and given that there's no better predictor of life success than psychometric intelligence, there's no better predictor of climbing, let's say, the economic ladder. There's no better marker of future success at birth than intelligence, including wealth. The differences between people in intelligence are pervasive and marked, and also very fundamentally.
Znači danas je ono uko trebalo postati.
Which is also an awful realization because we like to believe as, what would you say, compassionate people.
I napravio ona je bombica, nije da odnesem gore jedino. Ide. Nek te malo šapkira. Pa dvije sam pojio, nisam 3, ja mogu. Pa pojio, uzu hurmu. Jo, srećan, a nije mi se obrisalo ovo, što nisam ušao jedan da dan.
Sad se nije obrisalo.
Pa ono, 15. i 16. dan. 15. tipa dan.
Aha.
Ma zatvori. Ja sad se navičat na ovaj miš.
And continued their investigations into
Nekako mi je prebrz.
Imaš li srednje
Imam te
između...
tipke, imam.
Ne,
Al
imaš li
pokuš...
dugme iznad točkića?
Ima.
Tu se DPI mijenja.
Ali ne mogu da nađem ono između, ono što sam navikao.
Jebi ga.
10% of the population, and that the armed forces is always desperate for manpower and committed to using a career in the armed forces as a stepping stone for people, let's say, in the underclass or in the working class to move themselves up the economic hierarchy. So they're highly motivated to make use of everyone available, and yet concluded after their 50-year investigation that 10% of the population cannot be utilized in any productive manner whatsoever for military enterprises. And so it doesn't take much thought about that to understand that something approximating the same thing applies in the general world, which means that the conservative idea that everyone can get ahead merely as a consequence of diligent effort, and the liberal idea that everyone can be trained to do anything given enough resources are both seriously wrong, and nobody knows what to do about that. So now the psychometricians also outlined the basic structure of personality considered from a statistical perspective, generating the now well-known so-called Big Five models: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. Honesty, humility is sometimes added to that, as is
Samo sudeći, ja ću vratiti onaj stari miš. A nemam podloge adekvatne za ovaj izgleda, znaš.
Ne znam šta ti kažem na to.
Broken down each into their two aspects, make some reference to honesty, humility, and delve a bit into the patterns of the dark tetrad types, relating all of that back as we progress to the other psychological models that we're going to cover. So, that's the plan. We'll start with religious and mythological conceptualizations.
Kako space radi.
Historical context. So as I mentioned earlier, human beings of our type took our form something approximating 350,000 years ago, and so we've been around for quite a long time. One of the anthropological mysteries that bedevil us is, if we've been around for that long, why did it take us so long to get our act together, right? Because there's not a lot of evidence for rapid cultural progression till something approximating 20,000 years ago, something like that. And that means that we were occupied with God only knows what for about 320,000 years before that. And some of the darker speculation is predicated on the assumption that we couldn't get off the ground because we were too busy pulling anyone who was successful down and engaging in constant warfare with the other tribal groups in our, let's say, in our locale. And that whatever generated the unifying thrust of civilization, which was likely something like the pervasive spread of monotheistic religious systems, had to fight against both of those proclivities, envy, let's say, and the tendency to engage in continual, low-level, chronic, destructive warfare. So I studied the most archaic personality conceptualizations, including conceptualizations of transformation.
Šta mišlje strašan kome, sam ne jebe podloga. Soko ovo dole.
Ja, daj da te jebi.
Shark.
Something approximating the psychoanalytic tradition. He was a compatriot of Jung, for example, of Carl Jung, whose
Vidi ovo može se boja mijenjati.
heavily by Freud, and Eliade
Kulac.
very interested in the universal
Kada će stari odmah to toši s ruga.
religious ideation across cultures. He's a theorist who was cast aside by the postmodernists who now
Čemu
dominate
sam ja tu
the
imati
universities
odluke?
and certainly the field of inquiry into the history of religious ideas, because the postmodernists claim, this is the fundamental postmodernist claim, that there is no fundamental uniting meta-narrative. And so that's a critique, let's say an extended quasi-Nietzschean critique of the idea of God, a continuation of the death of God that Nietzsche so famously pronounced, but also the insistence that there is no fundamental unity that aggregates our personalities, let's say, within ourselves or across people. A very dismal and disenchanting view of human nature if you are not particularly amenable to conflict, because if there's no fundamental unity, then there's a fundamental disunity, and if there's nothing but a fundamental disunity, there's no integration of personality and there's no hope for peace. Now, the way the postmodernists dealt with that existential problem was by, what would you say, surreptitiously inserting a uniting meta-narrative derived from the Marxists, which is the narrative of power and the presumption that the only game in town is my attempt to attain dominance and status, likely or even inevitably at your expense, that there's no such thing as genuine dialogue. For example, there's no discussion between people of intrinsic worth and goodwill oriented towards establishing something like a maintainable peace, which would imply a kind of unity. There is only instead something like the Hobbesian war of everyone against everyone. That's a world predicated on power. And I believe, speaking psychoanalytically, that people who believe that are doing it primarily because they want a justification for using nothing but power. And I also not only believe, but think I know that a world that's predicated on nothing but power is indistinguishable from the atrocity-committing totalitarian states of the 20th century. Now, I had a discussion at one point with Camille Paglia, who's a very well-known literary critic, and she said something very interesting that's relevant to this course, something I'd never heard any other psychologically oriented thinker state, which was that if the academy, the universities, particularly the departments of English and their literary critics, had turned to the school that Eliade was part of, that included Erich Neumann and Carl Jung, for example, many other thinkers, particularly of the Bologin school, the history of the last 30 years, particularly with regards to the culture war, would have been entirely different. Mircea Eliade and his group, Jung, etc., massively influenced, for example, Joseph Campbell and the filmmakers who made Star Wars and who concentrated on the representation of the hero myth. The analysts of the hero myth assumed that that myth in particular was one form of the uniting narrative superstructures that did point to a overarching unity of human psychological and social conception.
Ja sam nju rođo, juče smo, prekjuče smo to ako palačine, brate.
Da.
Ko ispadaše tipke. Baš.
Jebi ga, šta da ti kažem, desi se nekada.
The shamanic tradition likely extended from the dawn of modern human beings, let's say approximately 350,000 years ago, until the present day. There are still societies that are essentially shamanic in their traditions extant on the earth, especially in places like the Amazonian jungle, although they're becoming more rare. There's a pattern to the shamanic rituals, which is, if properly understood, in my understanding, equivalent to analysis of the potentially creative breakdown of the individual human personality and its reconstitution on more solid grounds. So it's an early variant of the notion of death and rebirth as the pathway to progression upward, both psychologically and socially. And I think, and I'll show you in the course of this course, the existence of that pattern at every level of psychological analysis that we're going to engage in. I think it constitutes the core, which I referred to earlier, that unites all of the schools of personality theory and investigations into psychopathology that we'll cover. You can decide for yourself as you walk through this whether or not you find the evidence compelling. I think that one of the reasons that it's compelling, and this is actually a technical description of what makes a fact compelling, is that it occurs in multiple contexts that are independent from one another, right? So one of the ways that you judge the reality of something is whether it makes itself manifest to various independent modes of measurement. So that's why you have 5 senses, right? You can see something that isn't there. It's less likely that you will see and hear something that isn't there. It's less likely still that you'll see, hear, and touch something that isn't there. But that's enough. Not enough. You have 2 other senses just to nail things down. And even more than that, we're still skeptical, which is why if I believe something is real, I might ask you, and you, and look for consensus across all 3 of you to help me adjust the potential error of my perceptions. That's what you do when you use multiple methods of measurement, which is something, by the way, formally recommended by the psychometric psychologists who've been endeavoring to determine when a psychological measurement is real as a measurement, but also reflective of something real in the world. It's real if it can be detected in a variety of distinguishable and separate manners. And so the pattern that I'm going to lay out for you that characterizes the shamanic pattern of transformation does make itself manifest at multiple levels of analysis, and we'll use it as a uniting structure as we progress through the various theories. Now, I also think and hope, know for that matter, that you'll find this personally relevant, because understanding the pattern of personality transformation can help you maintain your faith when things fall apart, knowing, as you hopefully will come to, that having things fall apart at different levels of depth is actually a precursor to transformation such that things come together more reliably and productively. And understanding as well, and this is something absolutely fundamental, that to the degree that you can engage in the process of personality dissolution and its reconstitution voluntarily, your chances of success and your freedom from anxiety and your ability to maintain hope will be much, much improved. And so all of that's locked into the shamanic practices. And so we'll do an overview of that now, as well as a relatively deep dive into the abstract structure of the processes of transformation that the shamanic rituals both constitute and refer to. We'll start with the shamanic foundation, and then we'll close
4 minute
this first lecture with
34.
an analysis of the relationship between the Judeo-Christian
Idemo.
conceptualization of personality and its
Idemo,
transformations,
boss
which is
raid, construction
determinative for
site.
all the psychological theories that we're going to consider.
Veći od vodozbu.
A?
Attraction site, a single nešto.
Single? Ne, single. Multi. Single kasnije odradiš, kad ovo završiš, onda radiš single, znači uzmeš 50.000 iskustva, 10.000 onih para i to je to. Znači jednom dnevno i ćao zdravo. Ništa, znači sad odrati bossa pa se ponovo vratiti, malo sortirati lager, kako ja volim. I onda možemo nastaviti dalje. Ako Boki je rekao sada će doći,
you know how it is in your life. You have periods of time where you encounter something initially incomprehensible and profoundly difficult, and things fall apart around you and within you, and maybe there you are for some indeterminate period of time in the underworld, right? Suffering the torments of hell, but you emerge stronger and wiser, now able to deal with and to understand things that were beyond you to begin with. Well, that's the characteristic pattern of human adaptation. As such,
Sad gledam,
there's
Boki je
no
napisao
learning
prije
without
20
at
minuta da
least
samo
a
da upalim
small
kompjuter.
death, which is part of the reason that we're eternally resistant
Evo
even
te
to the
sunce, ne
learning
pališ
that might
nuklearni
transform
reaktor,
us. Now,
da
if you
treba toliko
understand that,
vremena.
and you'll come to
Yeah.
understand that more deeply in consequence of this class, you may be able to see not that every treasure has a dragon, let's say, but that every dragon has a treasure, which is an unbelievably useful thing to know as you encounter the difficulties that will beset you as you make your way through life. There's an insistence beginning with the shamanic practitioners themselves that the manner in which we encounter the unknown elements of life tears us into pieces before reconstituting us. And if we can understand that process and accept it and even welcome it and even worship it, you might say, then we're best positioned to transform ourselves when necessity makes either doing that or dying necessary. So what'll we examine in the Judeo-Christian tradition today, somewhat briefly? The notions of pride, self-consciousness, sin, and the fall of man that characterize the opening chapters of Genesis. The notion that personality can transform, but that's a consequence of humility. First,
WC je odrađen, sad možemo lagano naći rokanje. Evo neki cvika kažu nice, nice.
Ali pogledaj me.
To the agent of change, let's say the therapist, knowing or hoping that you have something to learn in some manner to change in a beneficial way, even if that's going to be painful to you, as a precondition for the transformative process to even begin. That's identical to the proclamation that religious humility, which is the opposite of the greatest sin, which is that of pride, is the
Save me. Evo te, patak stradiš.
At one man, the pulling of yourself back together and the uniting of that integrated self with, you might say, the world and the spirit of the world, the pulling together of that, and redemption, which is your ascent out of Dante's Inferno and the abyss back into something approximating the light. We'll also assess the role of prayer, so to speak, in Revelation, mostly in secular terms, because I want to draw your attention to the correspondence between those fundamentally religious ideas and our secular notions of thought itself. Here's a way of beginning that.
Debolan, samo lagano.
How is it that you go about thinking? Well, first of all, you
Evo
have to
ga,
have
evo ga.
something to think about. And so what does that mean? Well, you have to have a problem or something that you're interested in. That's conscience, the problem, or calling, the thing that you're interested in. Then you have to understand that you don't know.
I ne stiže nam Boki. 20 minuta pokušao upal kompjuter, ja mislim da je vrijeme za novi kompjuter.
Insufficiency, let's say, and ignorance. Then you have to believe that if you're ignorant and you want to know,
A tako i meni juče tastatura nastradala.
I jebi ga.
modern people, when they think, they say, well, something
Bolje da je centralna nastradala.
something revealed itself to me in consequence of my questioning without understanding that they're making a case.
Ne znam šta da ti kažem, bolje je tastatura nego čitav kompjuter da moraš zamijeniti.
A nije, bret.
Da?
Ma nije, bolje... Zabizo bolji kompjuter.
No možda bilo bolje. Ja moram početi nositi bombe ovdje. Evo neko baca bombe. Gdje se penješ, dečko?
Ne plotka, brate, mene zastupa.
Ima vrijeme za novi kompjuter. Gdje si ti? 24. Evo ti lajkić jedan.
That's the revelation of entropy, right? Friston also made the case, which was something I hadn't conceptualized, that so negative emotion is a marker for the emergence of entropy. He also made a case that positive emotion signified a decrease in entropy insofar as if you have a goal in mind, which frames your conceptions and your apprehension and structures your world, and you see yourself progressing towards that goal, which is something that makes you happy and enthusiastic. The reason that positive emotion emerges is because it marks a decrease in the distance between you and the goal, which is equivalent to a decrease in entropy. So Friston, we did work on this idea in my lab as well, has associated the notions of positive and negative emotion with one of the most fundamental concepts of the world of physics. And so why am I telling you that? Because the descent into the underworld is the dissolution into entropy, right? It's what happens to you when the ground under your feet dissolves and down you fall. Why down? Well, it's a metaphor, you know. It's the metaphor of hell. It's the metaphor of below. Why is down metaphorically negative for human beings? Well, up is positive, right? We climb upward, we look up.
Ja moram tamo ići na ono smeđi, na ono crveno ostrvo, onako tamo skupljati neke džiđe.
Dnevni questovi.
Ma nisu dnevni questovi, nego moram skupljati one džiđe, pa.
Koji džiđe, ba?
Pa da mogu šalter praviti, da mogu praviti sve ostalo. Blueprint, ne pojma kako se zove.
Aha.
Down is the more unconscious realm of the body. Up is towards vision, which is associated with illumination and enlightenment. Down is dust and dirt and decay and death and the grave. And up is heavenward and skyward and towards the light. And so the dissolution and descent into the underworld is the collapse of unifying structure into its constituent parts. Confusion. It's what you experience, for example, when the rickety old car that you can afford because you're really not a very hard and reliable worker breaks down on the way to the job that you hate to go to. And so what happens when the car breaks down? Well, first of all, whatever you're in is immediately not a car. And you think, well, of course it is, because it hasn't changed in its important material aspects. It still has four wheels, for example, and two doors, some of which might even be functional, depending on the cataclysmic state of your finances. But you're under a misapprehension with regards to your understanding of objects, because a car isn't something with four wheels and, let's say, two doors. It's a conveyance from one point to another. And when it stops conveying you, it's not a car. And when it collapses
Još,
on the
ovo ide
freeway,
na
let's say,
živce, ide
it's now
tamo,
a
ide
nest
vamo.
of snakes. and you're in it, and what's
Moj
the nest
to ide
of
na
snakes?
živce.
Well, how stupid are you that you're 35 years old, let's say, and that's the best bloody car you
Vidim
can
koju ću mi
afford?
boju
It's
sad
no
udati.
wonder your wife or your husband can't stand having you around. And is the fact that you're driving this old clunker a consequence of your own fundamental inadequacy,
Neće nijedno.
or is it a reflection of the
Da.
sorry state of the
Ma
cosmos
mijenjam
itself
boje,
and what
na
the
mišu.
cursed nature of man at the hand
What
of
the
God?
fuck?
And is it
Pa ima odozdo
likely that
prisniš
now you're
i
going
onda
to
mijenja
lose
boje
the
od
third job this year
da ono
because you didn't
šara,
get to work
ovako,
yet
ovako.
again? And are you perversely happy about that because you actually hate the damn job and your boss? And what does that say about the entire substructure of the capitalist world, let's say, and poor, oppressed, and enslaved you, struggling
Sno.
mightily to get your clunker off to your hateful
Just.
job? Well, that's what the car is turned into,
Zjebao.
right? All that confusion and chaos, all that noise and doubt, right? That's a descent into the underworld. That one happens to be involuntary, and that means it'll be signified by negative emotion.
Djora, moram
First,
ići,
that
pa se
indicates
vratit,
the
veoma
Đer-
brzo.
Đer sad ću kafaj.
multiplying of the pathways in your life, which had been reduced to get in the car, drive to work, do your job,
Neće kafa
and
još prođu.
expanded into
Ma
whatever
znam.
the hell mess you're in now, especially given that you can't afford the repair bill. So how are you going to get anywhere? And you're the sort of clueless character, too daft about your own belongings to not be constantly taken advantage of, let's say by malevolent mechanics who look upon you as a deserving object of exploitation, right? In no small part because of your own stupidity. Right. So all that mess, that's what the car turns into. That's a very interesting way of looking at it, and a very interesting way of looking at the collapse of your conceptions in your life as such. It happens all the time. That's associated with the pattern of shamanic initiation. So I'm going to read you some material from Eliade, and we'll analyze it as we read it. Eliade, in his studies of shamanism, which was a
Pa dragi, imam 170 popravki i 290 goriva, kantica.
So let's say 40,000 years.
Druže, igrao sam ti tenkova ikad.
And as I
Kako
said,
tenko? Evo igram tenkova, znači zove se Dark Charger i samo vozi preko zombija.
diverse places as far-flung as
A gdje si to kupio, Đorđe?
Charger.
Charger, pa da, 5000 onih novčića košta, Trinity,
Ba znam.
oni. Svi, ovo kako neću kupiti, Bog te odradio sve što treba da se odradi.
Homo sapiens, descent into the underworld, the collapse of the cosmos
Ja moram.
into the
Ja.
chaos from which it
Sad
was
ste nesta moram, a niste ja
generated.
stično ovako.
Something that happens psychologically when you descend into a state
Ma
of
ništa ne moraš.
confusion, and socially when your family
Ma
or your
moram.
community or
Šta
your
smo
tribe
rekli,
or your
znači,
nation descends into, say, chaotic fractionation.
Jel ideš negdje ili ne
and
ideš?
nothing is
Ići ću, ali ću doći pa ću opet. Ja moram voda klanjati. Ovako.
Aha, dobro, eto tako i doviđenja, znači nema šta. Ako je vrijeme, znači nema tu.
Na vrijeme je bilo 12, brate. Sad će drugi namaz. Kasnije. A dobro, radio sam, pa nisam mogao.
To je druga stavka.
I onda je
ali-
došao kući, daj odmah kompjuter da vidim.
A nemoj odmah kompjuter odradi šta treba da se odradi i onda kompjuter, ne može tako. Možda i može, u stvari ne znam ja. I u stvari vidim nakon tebe da može, jebi ga.
Pa nemoj da ti ja budem mjerila, baš ne znam.